afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Miller Center. It's great to see you all and to see a full room. 20 years ago yesterday, President George W. Bush addressed the nation after the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. And it's in a moment like that, following other moments in his presidency, the horrors of 9/11, the global war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, but also high points in the presidency. President Bush was trying to bring the nation together in a moment of grief, but also to try to provide a vision of hope and common purpose. And it's in moments like this that the extraordinary resource that the Miller Center and these two scholars that you have with you here today provide for us. We have, as you all know, because we released the George W. Bush oral history in the fall of 2019, right before the pandemic. Russell Riley and Barbara Perry, along with a number of colleagues, have brought together the oral history of this presidency. And today we're here to celebrate one of the first fruits of that project. That is what we call basic research. And from that basic research, our scholars take and produce books of scholarship where they learn new lessons from that administration by having talked to the senior-most officials from the administration. And this is only the first of many things that people will learn from the Bush presidency. We got into this business in 1977. There's a picture in the hallway outside of the Ford White House standing on the steps of the Miller Center. There's a young Dick Cheney, a young Don Rumsfeld, and Brent Scowcroft, for which there's not a photo of him ever being young. And a number of other people who served in the Ford administration, like Paul O'Neill, who would go on to serve as Secretary of Treasury for President Bush 43. Who would come back time after time to be interviewed for oral histories, the Reagan oral history, the Bush 41 oral history, and now this Bush 43 oral history. We have conducted an extensive set of oral history interviews for every president since Ford. Russell Riley has been there for almost all of them. Russell Riley is the co-director of our oral history program, along with Barbara Perry. Russell has logged, and it says here, and it's hard to believe, Russell, that you've done 1,500 hours of confidential interviews with senior administration officials, White House staff, cabinet officers, and foreign leaders. Barbara Perry, his co-director, who is the Jerry Belisle's professor here at the Miller Center and the director of presidential studies, co-leads the oral history program. Over her time here, she has conducted more than 120 interviews for the George H.W. Bush Project, the George W. Bush Project, and the Barack Obama Project, in addition to having pulled together and completed the Edward Kennedy Oral History Project and helping launch the Hillary Clinton Oral History Project. We don't just do presidents, we do other senior officials. And with that, it's a great opportunity to introduce our special guest who's joining us by Zoom today, Robert Gates. As you all know, Robert Gates served as U.S. Secretary of Defense from December 2006 in the Bush 43 administration, and he continued his service through July 2011 into the Obama administration. He's been awarded the National Security Medal, the Presidential Citizens Medal, and has twice received the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal. Secretary Gates also completed 3 Miller Center oral history interviews, and for that we are so grateful. The one person who is not here today is the other co-editor of this book. This book is co-edited by Barbara Perry, Russell Riley, and Mike Nelson. Mike is a professor at Rhodes College in Tennessee. He had planned to be with us today, but an ice storm is moving through Tennessee, and for his safety and to keep logistical complications to a minimum, Mike has decided to stay home. But Mike, if you're out there watching, which we hope and think you are, thank you for all of the work you do. He is also a senior fellow here at the Miller Center. So with that, over to you, Barbara.
Great, thank you so much, Bill. We have just marked 8 years of Bill's tenure here as the director and CEO of the Miller Center. And so he's served the equivalent of 2 presidential terms, and we hope, unlike presidents now, that he can carry on with at least 1 more term, maybe get up to the FDR mark. We also want to thank him so much for his interest in oral history and for joining us frequently. In fact, this week we did an oral history for the Obama Project that we're now into, and Bill joined us with that particular person he has known over the years, and it's really makes all the difference in the world for Russell and me to have someone who knows the person that we're interviewing. So thank you to Bill, and thanks so many of you here in the audience, in person. We have a full house today as well as online, and with C-SPAN. Many of you support the work of the Miller Center that is varied, and particularly for those of you who support presidential studies and our recordings program, where we go through the secret White House tapes of presidents, but also the oral history projects, as Bill has mentioned them. So Secretary Gates, I want to say a hello from Charlottesville and welcome you today virtually. And I thought I would start with you. First of all, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, thank you.
Oh, good, thank you, sir. When I invited you for the interview that you were so generous to give us 2 days last year for the Obama project, I went back and I looked at the interview that you did for the Bush 43 project. First of all, recognizing that that had been your second set of interviews with us because you were interviewed for the Bush 41 project. And as you were speaking to our colleague Mike Nelson for the Bush 43 project interview, I think out at your home, you mentioned Obama and you sort of chuckled, and in the transcript it says laughter because you said, I guess you'll be coming back to me a third time. And so that's how I began my invitation to you, which was, we're back, we're here again for the third interview, and that one of course was for the Obama project. So we hope you'll join us when that one is released some years down the road. Having said that, sir, given that you have participated in 3 of these oral history projects, tell us what you think is the value of giving your spoken narrative and others who have worked in these administrations with you. What is the value of those interviews for history, for teachers, students, biographers, journalists, but also practitioners such as yourself? And you have served in the administration of 8 presidents from both parties.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I would say that the great value is that it provides personal perspectives and personal experiences that often don't make their way into historical research. When you're going through documents and presidential records and so on, things can be pretty dry, and you end up sort of this happened and then that happened and so on and so forth. And yet when you have these oral histories, just think if we would have had an oral history with Franklin Roosevelt or Theodore Roosevelt or Abraham Lincoln. I think it brings the history to life and provides personal experience, personal points of view, people who can describe what it was like to be in the room when those decisions were made, who can talk about some of the humor, who can talk about how people were wrestling with decisions, about personal relationships that often don't find their way into the documents. So I think it just adds a whole new dimension to looking at presidential and other experiences.
Well, we agree with you so much, and certainly Russell and I, in sitting on these interviews and being part of the interview panel often with Bill Antholis. Spencer Bakich is here today. He participated with the Secretary and myself and others on the Obama interview for Secretary Gates. We can attest that just to exactly what you said, sir, and that is that it is history come to life. And that's why we enjoy it so much, but we also think it adds, as you said, that extra piece of the puzzle as historians and others go back to piece together what has truly happened.
Well, one thing, for example, that you'll never find in the documents is people sitting in the Situation Room and the jokes that were being told, or the witticisms, or something. Sometimes in the direst of circumstances.
Anything come to mind?
I think they're all in the oral histories.
Thank you. We like to hear that. That encourages people to go online, certainly, and also to purchase our book, where we have a number of these stories, and they are available for those of you who are here today out in the ante room. Having said that, too, I also wanted to note that based on the Bush 41 oral history that Russell conducted before I arrived, that taking off from that, Secretary Gates and Russell and I participated in a partnership between the Miller Center and Virginia Public Media in a recent documentary called Statecraft about the Bush 41 foreign policy team, which was a golden group of people, A+ in bringing their experience to bear, including Secretary Gates. And so you can watch that on PBS. You can watch it online on their Passport, I think it is called. So let me turn to Russell now and read to you something that will be familiar, because it is as you begin your chapter in this book, an introduction. And you say, Russell, no presidency in the lifetime of the Republic, referring to the Bush 43 presidency, George W. Bush, will be more difficult for history to get right than the 43rd. Tell us why you think that and why you began your chapter that way.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. First, I should let you know that having already been presented as somebody who does a lot of these interviews, I feel much more comfortable sitting down and asking questions of people in a private setting than I do in front of an audience like this, although it's terrific to see people again at the center. So that's sort of where my bread and butter is. But in terms of the question about how difficult it will be to get this president right for history, there are three factors that I write about in my chapter. The first one relates just to the basic controversies associated with his presidency. And controversy and passion are enemies to figuring out a presidency and to getting it right. And it takes a while for those passions to die down. I don't think we're there yet. I think it's going to take some time. But this was a presidency that was controversial from the very outset, right? I mean, it was the first president who'd come to office elected with a minority of the popular vote since Benjamin Harrison in 1888. We recall the controversy in Florida that precipitated his presidency with the so-called Brooks Brothers riot, with people creating a ruckus over the vote count. He came into office on the basis of a Supreme Court decision that was so improvisational that the justices said it shouldn't be used as a precedent for any other cases. And then once you get him into office, there are, just a host of really highly controversial conditions, including the failure to detect and prevent the attack of 9/11. But then after that, the decision to invade Iraq, the Abu Ghraib scandal, Hurricane Katrina, a massive economic crisis in 2007 and 2008. And so all of these are going to be complications for historians trying to get this right for future generations in terms of understanding this presidency. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the basic resources that we use to come to understand a presidency, those presidential records. And in this instance, the problems of history are problems of both feast and famine. If you go to the website of the George W. Bush Presidential Library, you'll learn that there are 70 million paper records there, as well as 200 million emails. And presumably, if you follow Robert Caro, the eminent biographer who said his method is to turn every page, some of you have probably seen this as a result of a documentary out on Caro now, but his method is turn every page. And I actually went through the calculations, and if you turned 1,000 pages a day, nonstop, it would take you 191 years to go through all of the evidence that's accumulated, and that's just the paper records. There are 3 times as much in the way of emails. So there's a massive needle in a haystack problem in terms of trying to come to terms with that mass of evidence. Then beyond that, in Barbara, help me.
Yes.
Where
Well,
did I leave off? In terms of...
yeah, what are all the issues that will cause us to continue to struggle with categorizing and evaluating President Bush 43?
Right. The problems with famine occur because of the inability of us to get these records cleared. There's a very small staff of archivists involved in getting them cleared, and therefore it will be, by one count, the George W. Bush Library is 240 years behind on dealing with FOIA requests. So if we don't have those archival records available, then you have to go to alternate sources, and the best of the alternate sources is oral history. The third point, in terms of the difficulties in understanding this administration or getting it right for history, ironically occurs as a result of a great success of the administration, and that is the attack of 9/11 was a one-off event. And the reality of that being a one-off event has a powerful influence on how we view that administration. The German Jewish philosopher Walter Benjamin once wrote that a man who dies at 35 will, by remembrance, always be remembered in subsequent history as a man who died at the age of 35. It's impossible to look on somebody's history like that without understanding the end, and that colors everything that went in. We today understand that 9/11 was a one-off event, and therefore our views of the Bush administration are colored by that experience, which is very different from the lived experience of the people who were in the administration at the time, who, on the basis of evidence from people like Condoleezza Rice, believed that every day after that was 9/12, that every effort they were making was geared towards making sure that there was not a recurrence of that event. And yet, from deep historical perspective and looking back on that, we have a tendency to underestimate how powerful an influence that was on the administration. And it will, I think, forever be a problem for us in terms of trying to understand the presidency because of that reality.
Well, thank you for that, both an introduction for today, but also your superb introduction to the book. Secretary Gates, let me turn back to you. You come into the Bush 43 cabinet as the second SecDef, as we call it in the business, the second Secretary of Defense, coming after Donald Rumsfeld, another of the people we had the privilege to interview, in fact, right here at the Miller Center. And he brought along the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Paul Wolfowitz, his second in command, and as communications people. He brought two of those people. So we like to point out that we sometimes, as we interviewed Secretary Gates in these instances, typically for just one to a group of us interviewing, but sometimes we'll say we say to all the secretaries, particularly, if you'd like to bring a team, feel free to do that. So first of all, if you will, sir, tell us what that was like to come in to an administration that's already 6 years down the road, 5 years down the road, replacing a Secretary of Defense who has become controversial in that time period. And then, if I may ask us a second part of the question, which is, you then transitioned into the Obama administration because he asked that you stay on, and you stayed in that cabinet for a couple of years. And perhaps if you could for us, compare and contrast the commander-in-chief leadership styles of those two presidents, 43 and 44.
So when I received a telephone call on a Saturday morning in late October from the National Security Advisor, Steve Hadley, whom I'd started working with in the Nixon administration, asking, and it was just out of the blue, would you be willing to, if the president asked, would you serve as Secretary of Defense? Now, the backstory to this is that 19 months before that, they had asked me to be the first Director of National Intelligence. And I'd gone into the White House and talked with Hadley, and I'd talked with Andy Card, who was then the Chief of Staff. And we wrestled with it. The irony is I had opposed the creation of Director of National Intelligence, thought it was unworkable. And here they were asking me to be the first person to occupy the job. And so needless to say, I had a lot of questions because I felt there were a lot of deficiencies in the law. They basically agreed to everything I asked. And but I still was wrestling with in terms of authorities and so on. But I was still wrestling with the decision, and ultimately, and I thought I was going to take it, and I'm pretty sure they thought I was going to take it. But at the last minute, after the inaugural, I had told Andy Card that I would call him the Monday after the inauguration, after I'd had a chance to think about it one last time over the weekend. And I called him that Monday morning, and I told him I decided not to do it. And I think he was pretty shocked. I was pretty surprised myself because everything that had led up to that, I think, had led them to believe that I was going to do it. So I told my wife afterward, I said, the one piece of good news about this is that the Bush administration will never, ever ask me to do anything again. So fast forward, Hadley calls me. Interestingly enough, this time, I said, Steve, we've got a lot of young Americans out there fighting and dying, doing their duty. And if you ask me to do this, I will certainly do it. So no hesitation on that one. But after I hung up the phone and contemplated what I had to tell my wife, I was thinking, and I told her, I said, well, look, Bush just lost control of both houses of Congress. And we're losing in 2 wars and losing them both. What possibly could go wrong? So the good news about going into the administration was that I knew both Condi Rice, by then Secretary of State, and Hadley, Steve Hadley, National Security Advisor, very well. Condi and I had worked together on the Bush 41 NSC when I was Deputy National Security Advisor. And I had, as I said, I had known Steve since 1974. So I was going in to work with a couple of people that I really knew well and knew there wouldn't be any backstabbing, knew that we would work together productively as a team. One of the things that I was committed to that would be easy with Condi was I had observed over much of my career, most of my career, that Secretaries of State and Secretaries of Defense not only didn't get along, mostly didn't like each other, and sometimes really hated each other. And often were not even on speaking terms. So I was determined, and I've always felt that poorly served the president. So I was determined that Condi and I would have a positive working relationship. And I also had my other approach to it was, you know, when you're the Secretary of Defense, you never have to elbow your way to the table. You got all the people, all the money, and all the weapons. So, you know, nobody's going to exclude you from a meeting. So I just wasn't worried about that. So I was able to start the Bush administration with good personal relationships with these other leaders based on long acquaintance. I had not, interestingly enough, the whole time that I was at Texas A&M, and while George W. Bush had been governor of Texas, I'd had one photo op with him, but I really did when I had my interview with him was the first conversation I'd ever had with the man. So we took some getting used to of getting to know one another, but that was pretty easy. He's a very easy guy to get along with, and he's got a great sense of humor and so on. And you know, by that time also, he had been president for almost 6 years. So he was a very experienced person at that point. And so I felt very comfortable going into that administration for all those reasons. I began to get word, both in the press and privately, in the summer of 2008, that both John McCain and Barack Obama were considering asking me to stay in the event they won the election, because we were in 2 wars, to provide some continuity. But the idea would be just a temporary thing, a bridge, if you will. But I got word from Senator Jack Reed in July, late July, I think, saying that Obama would like to talk to me. And I said, well, Jack, I don't think that's appropriate. I can only be Secretary of Defense for one president at a time. And he wanted to talk to me about whether I might be willing to stay on. And I said, but and he called back in September, I think, and perhaps October, and asked the question again. And I said, look, Jack, I can't do that until after the election. But I said, I could provide some questions for you that for him to consider, that would guide our conversation. That would basically be a basis for a conversation that really tackled some tough issues. And he said, okay. So I put together a list of 10 questions. And this is a little unusual because, shall we say, I don't think there's much precedent in American history for a prospective cabinet officer to be interviewing the president-elect rather than vice versa. So I wrote the questions. I had them hand-delivered to Jack, and he delivered them to Obama. And he called me back literally 2 days later. He said, Obama is even more interested now in having you come in talking to you about this job, and he thought the questions were really great. He said, but he wants to know, do you want written answers? I said, Jack, it's not an exam. It's a guide to a conversation. And, you know, the first question, and so when we had our secret meeting in the firehouse at Reagan National Airport right a few days after the election, and it was just the two of us in the room, he pulls this piece of paper out of his pocket, and that's the list of questions. And the first question was, how do you know you can trust me? We don't know each other. And it kind of went from there. Who's going to be on the team? What's your attitude toward Iraq? Had basically been put in place by Bush with the agreements with the Iraqis. But here's what you've said about Afghanistan. What do you think about Afghanistan? What are you going to do in Afghanistan? What about the defense budget, and so on? And we had a really good conversation. At the end, he said, well, I'd like for you to stay on as Secretary of Defense. And I said, well, you know, kind of about how long? And we talked about, well, maybe about a year or thereabouts. What I didn't realize then was that I put a comma at the end of that sentence and he put a period. I'm sorry, I just got that reversed. I put a period at the end of the year. He put a comma. And so I ended up actually working for him longer than I worked for Bush. So almost, well, a little over 2.5 years. That was a very different experience because while I knew very superficially or not very well, General Jim Jones, who was to be his first first national security advisor, I really didn't know anybody else in the administration. There were a few who'd been around as long as I had, who I had known in the Carter administration when I worked in the Carter White House as Spig Brzezinski's executive assistant. But mainly there were a lot of people I didn't know. I didn't know Hillary Clinton at all. So based on my experience with Condi, one of the first things I did after we were all announced was invite Hillary to come to the Pentagon and have lunch with me. And I talked about the way Condi and I had worked together and the importance of us being on the same page and how we can work together to help the president. And she was all in. And so she and I had every bit as good a working relationship as I had with Condi. And I think that's I know that's unprecedented in American history to have two successive women secretaries of state and both of them having a really good relationship with the Secretary of Defense. So, I got to know people, but obviously it was a different environment. For one thing, it was a brand new administration, so everybody was learning and kind of new to the job. I remember the first meeting in the Situation Room, everybody had their cell phone out. and was, checking texts and emails and so on and so forth. And afterward, I went to Jim Jones and I said, Jim, they're broadcasting everything we're talking about to the entire rest of the world. You got to do something. So, next meeting, nobody had a phone. And so we had to there was progress to be made. But I will say that, they made me feel welcome. I will say there were some awkward moments, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when I first joined the administration, was Admiral Mike Mullen, who had become chairman under President Bush, and had been there only 6 months, less time than I had. And we'd go into the Situation Room and there'd be a meeting, and this was in the early weeks of the administration, and they would just savage the Bush administration and all the dumb decisions and how could they possibly have thought of all these things and everything. And Mike and I would get in the car to go back to the Pentagon, and we'd look at each other and say, don't they realize we were part of that team? And what are we, chopped liver? Are we invisible in there? And so, we had to put up with a fair amount of that, which happens, as you said, I've worked for 8 presidents, 4 of them in the White House, and it happens in every new administration. But, we went through those growing pains. I remember at one point, Obama had an offsite for the new cabinet. And these are the kinds of things you don't see in the documents. And he asked me to talk to the cabinet officers as somebody who'd been around, not just as a cabinet officer for a couple of years at that point, but somebody who'd been in the White House and worked in these things and so on and so forth. And so I made some disparaging comments about the White House staff and told the cabinet officers they needed to stand up for themselves. And when somebody says the White House is calling, just say buildings don't call people. If the chief of staff wants to talk to me, I'll talk to him. But if it's some GS-13 staff member, I'm a member of cabinet. But the thing I said that several of them have come back to me over the years and that they said made the hair on the back of their neck stand up was, at the end of my remarks, I said, the one thing you all have to remember, no matter what cabinet position or agency you lead, is that right now, somebody in your organization is breaking the law. And even if they're not breaking the law, they are doing things you will hate. So your job is to figure out a process to make sure that that you find out about those things soon enough before people do real damage. And that was the first time any of them had ever, most of them hadn't run really big organizations before. And that was the first time some of them thought about that. But the bottom line is, it was a pretty smooth transition. Obama made it pretty easy. And I told him, I said, it's your Department of Defense. So this department will be staffed by all of your people. And I don't have time, nor the Rolodex, to go out and hire all your people. So you send me candidates for all these jobs. And my only criterion is, can they do the job? Will they be competent? That's all that I care about. But they also need to know that I had a say in their hiring, because I might need to fire them. And which had happened on several occasions in the Bush administration, so it wasn't a theoretical proposition. And so that's what they did. They would send me candidates, and there were only 2 or 3 that I said I didn't think could do the job, and sort of did a thumbs down. So it was a pretty smooth transition. In terms of personalities, I really didn't have a close personal relationship with either one of them. I like to say that I wasn't into mountain biking, so I lost my bonding opportunity with Bush. I was a foot too short and 20 years too old to play basketball with Obama. But we had a very close professional relationship, and there was a lot of kidding around, and a lot, it was casual enough that you could joke with each other and everything. He'd complain to me, Obama would complain, sometimes when we were just meeting one-on-one, and he'd complain about all the problems he was facing and so on. I said, so tell me again why you wanted this job. And I would say that they both were very interested in hearing the views of other people, of hearing contrary points of view and taking those into account. Both were very patient and willing to listen. And I had a lot of debates, a lot of arguments with President Obama over a variety of things, more toward the end of my time, Libya, Egypt, and so on. But they both welcomed it. Interestingly, Bush would ask, okay, who does anybody have anything they want to say? Obama, on the other hand, was more like a college professor, and he'd go around the room and make everybody talk. You couldn't rely on not sticking your hand up to allow the gaze to kind of pass by you. In Obama's situation room, everybody was going to get called on to give their views. I would say that fundamentally, Bush was more reliant on his gut, on his instincts, and Obama was more analytical and took more time to make decisions. And on decisions that weren't urgent, he would take a lot of time, unlike Bush, who tended to make decisions pretty promptly, pretty quickly. Now, if Obama needed to make a quick decision, he was always willing to do it. And for somebody who had never run anything, I was always impressed by his embrace of decision making. He was not shy about making decisions. He was very clear that he relished the opportunity to make decisions. He once told me one of the reasons he ran for president was that he was so bored in the Senate. But his decision making, he could make a decision very fast if he had to, and did. But on those situations where there was not a deadline or not an urgent situation, he would take a lot of time and a lot of meetings, and Afghanistan was a good example of that. That's a very long-winded answer to your question.
But so rich, and again, our audience can see why, just sitting back and listening to your descriptions of your service, leavened with humor, is not only insightful and informative, but it's entertaining. Just a couple points to raise. One is you all have at your seats a card and a pencil, so feel free to write your questions for those of us on the stage and certainly for the secretary, and we'll collect those and save 10 minutes or so at the end of our hour today. And likewise, if you're watching live online, please submit your questions there too. And I'll have one other thing to say before turning back to Russell, and that is as a lifelong college basketball fan, and of course being here at the University of Virginia, the home of the 1919 NCAA national champions, sir, I would think you would have been a great point guard to President Obama's shooting guard or his small forward. Russell.
No, I was basically going to echo your point, is that one of the great advantages of having the secretary here with us today is you get a sense about what it's like to be in an oral history interview with us, that he has repeated some of the things that he said in the interview and how enjoyable and enlightening it is. And you can imagine that if you combine this small portion of an interview with a much more elaborate version of that interview, and then you add 50 or 60 or 100 others, the kind of information and evidence you get about a presidency is just extraordinarily rich. And it's available for you to look at. You can go to our website, and Secretary Gates's interviews have been cleared. They're available for you to read. You can get the full elaboration on, not on President Obama yet, because we wait until the end of a project to make those available, but certainly his commentary on earlier presidents, including President Bush, and I quoted from him briefly in the essay that I wrote. So that original data is there, we make it available, and then what we do with it is we try to make a first effort through these edited volumes to put an interpretive gloss on it as scholars. Spencer, a fine chapter on the Iraq intervention. Barbara, you want to talk about your your judiciary.
I
article.
do. So I am, in addition to, I like to think of myself as an expert on the presidency, but I know for certain that I am on the Supreme Court. That is an expert on it. I'm not on the Supreme Court, but I think I'm an expert on it and served a fellowship there in the mid-90s with Chief Justice Rehnquist. So I wrote on the appointments by President Bush to the Supreme Court, and I start with Bush v. Gore, a little case that you might have heard about in 2000. And I was fortunate enough to, because of my contacts at the court, to get a seat at what we thought would be the only oral argument in Bush v. Gore. It turned out there were two of them, you might recall, before the court handed down its final decision. And so I start with that in my chapter in this book. And I start with Ted Olson, who became the Solicitor General for Bush 43, but was the lead attorney in arguing the soon-to-be president's case, Governor Bush's lawyer at the Supreme Court. So we had a whole day with him in Washington. Myself, one of our fellows here currently, Sarah Wilson, joined me. She is a lawyer. So we had a wonderful conversation with him, and I quote from him where he says, he comes out into the courtroom, and the courtroom, if you've been to the U.S. Supreme Court, is about 3 times this size. So it's like a cathedral. It holds about 300 people. And Ted Olson comes out and he sees every important person in Washington seated there. I was very close to sitting next to Ted Kennedy. Men and women had come from the Congress. Caroline Kennedy was there with her uncle. Nina Totenberg, who covers the court for NPR. Of course, all the press were there. And there were people marching around outside for Bush, for Gore. Al Sharpton was there marching around. So Ted Olson looks out and he says to us in his oral history, I said to myself, close your eyes, stop and think about this for 30 seconds, because someday people are going to want to hear these stories. And sure enough, we got to hear them. So let me give you a pop quiz, those of you who are here today, or if you're watching online or you're watching an archive. So in 2005, right before the 4th of July weekend, Sandra Day O'Connor, such a historic woman on the court, the first woman appointed by Reagan in '81, she announces in the middle of that summer, surprisingly, that she is going to retire from the court. And the reason it was a surprise was that Chief Justice Rehnquist had been diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and it was thought that if someone was going to leave the court that summer, it would be he. But she went in to see him, and he said, no, I don't intend to leave. And she said, well, I was thinking about leaving next year. And he said, well, just in case I leave next year, we can't have 2 people leave next year, so you better go ahead and leave now. So she did. Anybody know who was appointed to that associate justice position? John Roberts. And you might say, wait a minute, I follow the court. He's the Chief Justice. She wasn't the Chief Justice. As it turned out, he didn't even get to his confirmation hearings for that associate justice position for Sandra Day O'Connor's seat, and Chief Justice Rehnquist died over the Labor Day weekend, 2005. Knowing that, as President Bush 43 did, and he had a superb process for working these things out. He had Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, Alberto Gonzales, who was his White House counsel at that time, his staff secretary, Harriet Miers. They had gotten together in a group before any of this happened to talk about the first people they might appoint. And they went through the whole first term without an appointment. So they were ready. And they knew that John Roberts was viewed as the top legal mind in his generation. So it was a pretty easy promotion before he even got to be an associate justice to go ahead and put him on the Chief Justice position. And by the way, that's perfectly doable. You don't have to go from being associate up to being chief. And he sailed through his confirmation hearings. All right, anybody remember then who came back to the president, came back to being the next nominee? Harriet Miers. People have forgotten about that, but Harriet Miers, who was his staff secretary at the time, a good friend of the president's from Texas. She had worked in law firms there. She was the first woman head of the Texas Bar Association. She had headed up the Lottery Commission and cleaned up a lot of corruption there. A very highly thought of lawyer in the Lone Star State. And circling back to something Secretary Gates said about how President Bush made decisions. This actually gives you an example of two approaches. And Secretary Gates said oftentimes he went with his gut. Well, actually, in first naming John Roberts, he went through the process. So they had this very careful setup of going through the committee. They had interviewed John Roberts, they had interviewed Samuel Alito, they had interviewed Michael Luttig, all federal judges, all conservatives. And the president followed that to get to the Chief Justice, John Roberts. But he went with his gut for Harriet Miers, a friend of his, but also someone he knew would, in his mind, would be conservative enough. Remember, he was a compassionate conservative. He thought that she was. They had their friendship. He thought they had ideology. He thought she was meritorious, and he thought that she would be a good Supreme Court justice. You might recall that that didn't work. And so we had the opportunity, Russell and I, to bring Harriet Miers here to interview her. We went to Washington to interview Alberto Gonzales. We interviewed Karl Rove. We interviewed Chief Justice Rehnquist, or excuse me, Dick Cheney, all the people who had served on that process committee. And as it turned out, the right wing of the president's party did not want Harriet Miers in that O'Connor seat because you might remember it was called the swing seat. She was a moderate conservative, and sometimes she voted with liberals, particularly on abortion and affirmative action, and sometimes she voted with conservatives. And the right wing of the party had been just waiting for her to leave so they could put a certain conservative in that role. And they didn't have that faith in Harriet Miers. They thought she might be more like O'Connor. And she realized she was hurting the president. She also was said she wasn't an expert in constitutional law. And she admitted that. But it would be like learning a language for the first time, and in 2 or 3 weeks having to go up to the Hill and meet with senators in one-to-one meetings and not be able to speak the language. So she saw she was hurting the president, and she stepped aside. And she says, and I quote this in the book, she says, I just wanted to step aside, make it okay for the president. I wasn't hurt by it. She said, I went back into the administration. I went back to being staff secretary. And when the president made Alberto Gonzales the attorney general, she became the White House counsel. So with such grace, she solved that problem. The president's people and the president went back to the process and chose Samuel Alito. And so think about that series of steps in history, the kind of what ifs. What if Harriet Miers had stayed the course, and what if she had gotten confirmed? Would we be where we are on issues of abortion or affirmative action if she had ended up being more like Sandra Day O'Connor? And then you get the 3 Trump appointees on top of that. So at the very end, I quote from Ed Gillespie, who was a political advisor to the president. And when we interviewed him here, he talked about that situation and how difficult that was for the president and for Harriet Miers. But he said, you know, when we invited Samuel Alito to the White House to come meet the president and then be introduced, he said, there was Harriet Miers, as gracious as could be. And he said, you know, it was just like Harriet. And then Alberto Gonzales said, most of the time, the president would try to follow a process, and one of the times he didn't, in going with his gut and choosing Harriet Miers, it didn't work. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Russell and say, we've got about a minute or so to go before we ask for your questions. Russell, you have, in your reference in the book, you talk about the 3 presidencies of George W. Bush. What do you mean by that?
Very, very quickly. Most presidents served during a time of relative constitutional stability. That is a situation where the distribution of powers and the equation of powers among the branches is relatively stable. And that kind of constitutional environment tends not to change very much over time. One of the interesting things about George W. Bush is there were actually 3 different sets of constitutional regimes that prevailed during the course of his presidency. The first one being one of kind of constitutional balance. We'd come out of a Cold War era of relatively elevated presidential powers into a post-Cold War period where Congress and the courts and interest groups had become somewhat resurgent. And in fact, President Bush had been elected not to exercise, sort of soaring presidential leadership, but basically to be a governor of the country. He was pursuing, importantly, tax cuts and education reform, which were not heavy lifts, really, education reform more so, but because he needed to bring his own party. And so the President Bush that we elected in 2000 was was not supposed to be an extraordinarily powerful political figure. And yet, after 9/11, because he becomes a war president at that point, you see this extraordinary change in the character of the Bush presidency. And it was predictable because this had happened in repeated instances in America's past, where you had gone from a president of relative constitutional equality to a situation where presidents had been terrifically empowered because of the commander-in-chief's role. And this is what prevails at least until 2006, 2007. The short version of this is that I'm still puzzling over what happens at the end, because there is a signature moment. Secretary Gates referred to this earlier with the congressional midterm elections in 2006. What happens? The president loses both chambers of Congress at a single midterm. That's a relatively rare event in American history. It's clearly only happened 6 times, and 4 of those times were immediate post-war elections: 1918, 1945, the post-Cold War election of 1994 with the Republican Revolution. So that history leads you to wonder whether the American people weren't acting in 2006 as though we were in a kind of post-war world. Now, we hadn't finished with Afghanistan, we hadn't finished with Iraq, so how do we explain this? Well, maybe the American people thought that the war on terror had gone by the wayside. We were, the president had encouraged people to go back to acting normally, and they had. And so perhaps this is a sign that the American people were supportive of what the president had done. They felt like he had solved the problem of the war on terror. But there's another, the other interpretation is, no, he bollocksed war on terror, and that we had believed that he had not properly exercised this massive authority invested in him, and therefore we didn't want him to serve as a powerful commander-in-chief anymore. This importantly has an impact on how the country deals with the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, because you don't have, as you might otherwise have had, an extraordinarily powerful presidency to ride herd over the government response and the economic response to that. Instead, you get this sort of odd hybrid version of leadership housed in the Treasury Department with Hank Paulson, with the Federal Reserve with Tim Geithner, and so forth. And so I'm not telling you that I have this completely resolved. I'm just telling you that there is an interesting historical signature in 2006 that indicates that that leadership regime changed, and I'm still trying to parse through exactly why that is. I haven't solved it yet, but you get more of that in this chapter anyway.
Stay tuned, stay tuned. Well, thank you for submitting your questions. Mr. Secretary, you won't be surprised to know they're all for you. Russell and I are not offended because people can see us anytime. But we want to start with this one, and it is: a withdrawal from Afghanistan was always going to be a difficult task. Can you, sir, offer your views on the planning for the withdrawal that went on, as you see it, up to 2021 and the withdrawal under the Biden administration?
Well, my perception from the outside is that there really wasn't any planning. It seems to me that once President Trump cut the deal with the Taliban, that the Defense and State Departments, overseen by the NSC, at that point should have begun reaching out to Afghans who had worked for us and with us, who would be at risk under the Taliban, and not necessarily beginning an evacuation at that point, but getting contact information. How do we get to you? And also planning, how would we conduct an evacuation? How do we get these people out of the country? And the notion of having one airfield outside of Kabul, where people from all over Afghanistan would have to find their way to Kabul with documentation proving they'd worked for the Americans, but having to go through Taliban checkpoints to get to Kabul. So there should have been planning for multiple evacuation points, whether it included Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e Sharif, but 4 or 5 places. Get to those places and we will get you out of the country. And having a means of contacting these people and then beginning that process. Now, President Ghani was against any evacuation. He thought that would make his government look weak and so on. But it seems to me we had an obligation to these people. We could have done a much better job of our contacts with them. Also, I would say strategically, I was with those who believe we should have kept 4,000 or 5,000 troops there, because our NATO allies also had 5,000 or 6,000 troops there, and so that was 11,000 to 13,000 troops. And the most important thing they did at that point was help protect the contractors who were supporting the Afghan army, getting them food, getting them ammunition, providing for their transportation, the logistics, the reason the Afghan army collapsed in no small part was because they were abandoned when all of the contractors left or were leaving. And so we could have sustained that position, I think, for some period of time. President Biden said, well, the Taliban, there'd already been an agreement. He couldn't change the agreement that Trump had signed, but he did change the agreement because Trump had said, we're going to go out. The agreement was we'll go out in May of 2021. And in fact, Biden did change that to August or to August. So, and that was in the middle of the fighting season as well. They could have waited until winter when things had calmed down a little bit or there was less active conflict. So I think there were a number of areas where we could have done significantly better planning in terms of that whole tragedy.
Thank you. You always seem very well rested, sir, to me, but there's a question here that says, what international issues keep you up at night? And what, if anything, gives you hope?
Well, you know, I started working at the NSC as an NSC staff member in the Nixon administration, worked there through the Ford administration, ended up going back for 3 years under the Carter administration, was Deputy National Security advisor under President Bush, was Director of Central Intelligence under Deputy Director under President Reagan, Director under first President Bush. So by the time I became Secretary of Defense, I kind of had my fill of being kept up at night. and to tell you the truth, I got asked this question and by a young soldier in Afghanistan. And he asked me, what keeps you up at night? And at that point in my life, I looked straight at him and I said, you do. What happens to you is what keeps me up at night. But I'm happy to say, you know, I've been out now for, it'll be a dozen years this July. There's not much that keeps me up at night anymore.
Just in our off-the-record conversation when we chatted to you most recently, we did talk about our mutual concern about deer in our yards eating our azaleas, and you gave me some very good advice about tape, about anti-deer tape on the bushes, just offering that today's practical garden tips as spring comes on us. But one thing that, as academics, that would have probably kept us up at night would have been to have to be the president of a major state university, as you were of Texas A&M. And so I'd like to point out that in that resume that very modestly the secretary just named for you also put in the presidency of Texas A&M, where he was also highly successful and very popular, which is almost an oxymoron among faculty is to have a popular university president, but he managed that as well. So I just think that in this time of fraught politics, in this time of divisions in politics, and we've seen it at other times in our country, but we're more aware of it, I think, now, particularly because of media, to have the kind of model that is exemplified in an exemplary fashion by Secretary Gates. Let's give him a big round of applause today. Sir, we thank you for your service to our country, and we thank you for